Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Tom Parker. I'm the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event, co-hosted and presented in partnership with the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and of course the ACBC. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders both past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands from which each of you connected through the live stream on today's event. I'd like to thank the ACBC members, the ACRI stakeholders, and of course ACBC's national sponsor, MA Financial, for hosting this evening. For your support, hospitality in this magnificent venue is greatly appreciated. To say this evening's event is timely is perhaps an understatement. As we witness America's retreat from globalisation and the enormous global financial disruption underpinned by Trump's tariffs, all of us have suddenly become geopolitical strategists and macroeconomists. But underlying the truth for Australia is that we are a trading nation, a nation that depends on a rules-based global order underpinned by free trade agreements and regional agreements such as the 10th anniversary of ChAFTA, which we're here to explore and celebrate this evening. As many commentators have remarked, including our own ACBC National President David Olsen, who sends his apologies and has just returned from 2 weeks in China, we are at a pivotal time as the region and China see an opportunity among the chaos. If we fail to respond strategically, Australia risks not only being sidelined in the critical trade flows, but also missing the capital, technology and partnerships essential to our economic and energy transition. Inaction isn't an option, but neither is escalation. Australia must remain open to trade, to innovation and crucially to investment that supports our economic transformation. Australia's strength lies in building stable, rules-based partnerships and shaping future standards, of which ChAFTA is a brilliant example. Tonight is an opportunity, of course, to reflect on the importance of a historic bilateral free trade agreement that turbocharged our economic trade with China, but also to look to the future to ensure our continued prosperity. We are very, very fortunate to have the Senator, the Honourable Don Farrell, Australia's Minister for Trade and Tourism, with us tonight in perhaps what might be a welcome break from the Zoom meetings and other things to secure our trade future, supporting our industry, and no doubt trying to unpack the uncertainty that is emanating from the White House. Minister Farrell, along with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, have played a crucial role in stabilising our relationship with China and removing the trade barriers, which ensures we can progress our shared interests and engage and collaborate with our largest trading partner in the spirit of practical cooperation at such a pivotal time. Thank you, Minister Farrell, for being such a strong supporter of both the ACBC and ACRI, and more importantly, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Minister.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for the opportunity to come and address you all this evening. I was actually here on Friday night at the Opera House with my youngest daughter, and we had the pleasure of seeing Nijinsky, the ballet, and I can't say I'm an amazing fan of ballet, but I really did enjoy this one. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend it. As Tom did, I'll acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet. I'd also like to acknowledge two of my wonderful predecessors. Yes, that's you, Mr Emerson, and Mr Robb, both of whom were fantastic trade ministers. And did wonderful things to promote our trade and continue to be very actively involved in all of the things that we do in the trade space. Can I also welcome my good friend from the Chinese Embassy, Minister-Counsellor Feng. Great to see you here tonight, and we've had many wonderful evenings together at the Embassy, and can you pass on my best wishes to the Ambassador? We have developed a terrific relationship, and I very much credit him with all of the good work that's occurred over the last 3 years. So if you can pass on my best wishes to him. Also, the event co-organisers, the Australia-China Business Council and the Australia-China Relations Institute. This is a really significant occasion because it marks the 10th anniversary of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And you know, when the world is all focusing on free trade agreements, it's fantastic to be here with a wonderful partner like China. ChAFTA has made a major contribution to the prosperity, particularly of Australia, but I also like to think of China over the past decade. Our trading relationship with China is our largest, accounting for around a quarter of Australia's total trade, and trade with China exceeds that with our next 3 largest trading partners combined. So I think that's a point worth making. Trade with China exceeds that of our next 3 largest trading partners combined. So an enormous amount of trade. And as Professor Lawrenson, in his paper released today, says Australia's trade with China since ChAFTA has more than doubled. And it's grown from roughly $146 billion a decade ago to almost $26 billion in the 2023-24 year. Now, as Tom mentioned, the Albanese Labor government has worked tirelessly to stabilise the Australia-China relationship, which, as I said, benefits both our countries. When the Albanese Labor government came to office, trade impediments imposed by China affected over $20 billion worth of Australian exports. And we have worked industry by industry, sector by sector, to get these trade impediments removed. When I started out on this exercise, a lot of people told me that it couldn't be done. We couldn't get that trade back, that we'd lost it for good. It certainly didn't happen overnight, but with hard work, persistence and continued engagement, we have secured a good outcome for both Australia and China. The Albanese Labor government's steady hand on the trade tiller has led to the stabilisation of an economic relation over the last 3 years. It's been a remarkable turnaround, and it's a testament to the benefits of calm, careful and calibrated approach. Since becoming Trade Minister almost exactly 3 years ago, I have met my counterpart and good friend, Commerce Minister Weng Wentao, 9 times, including in my home state of Adelaide, where he came with Premier Lee midway through last year. If Labor is re-elected for a second term, and I have the honour of continuing as the Trade Minister, I plan to travel to Shanghai to attend the China International Import Expo in November and hopefully again meet up with Minister Weng Wentao, and also stay at my favourite hotel in China, the Peace Hotel, and sleep in the Charlie Chaplin room, which is my favourite room in the Peace Hotel. To be clear, the government is clear-eyed about the challenges in our bilateral relationship and the differences that we must manage. We are committed to navigating our differences wisely while always putting our national interest first. For a re-elected Albanese Labor government, the ongoing stabilisation of trade relations with China would continue as a priority, as would our efforts to open up new market access opportunities for Australian businesses to sell their products around the world. Australia is a great trading nation. As we face global uncertainties spurred by protectionist measures, including the US tariffs, we are redoubling our efforts to strengthen relationships, diversify and find new opportunities. The benefits of this trade flow to Australians in the form of more well-paying jobs, more business opportunities and a lower cost of living. 1 in 4 Australian jobs relate to trade. Jobs in export industries pay 10% more than the average, and Australia's economic prosperity is directly linked to open and stable international markets. That's why the Albanese Labor government is focused on generating new and diversified trade and investment opportunities for Australian businesses. Trade diversification will remain a key policy plank of a re-elected Albanese government. As we have learnt the hard way, putting all of your eggs in the one basket is not a good business strategy. If re-elected, a Labor government will continue efforts to create new market access opportunities, whether that's through the removal of technical trade barriers with existing trading partners or enhancing regional relationships like we're doing with our ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, or by securing new trade deals as we've done with the United Arab Emirates and we're working towards with India and the European Union. Finally, a sincere thanks to the Australia-China Business Council and the Australia-China Relations Institute. I applaud the resilience that you have shown in maintaining your stake in the Australia-China relationship, a relationship that will continue to grow into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Farrell. Well, the nature of this evening in ChAFTA demands that obviously that we listen and engage in dialogue with our Chinese partners, and I'm delighted to introduce a good friend of both ACBC and ACRI, Mr. Feng, Minister-Counsellor of Economic and Commercial Affairs at the Chinese Embassy since 2022. Thank you, Minister Gao.
Thank you, Tom. Senator, the Honourable Don Farrell, Minister of Trade and Tourism, the Honourable Andrew Robb, the Honourable Dr Craig Emerson. I know you are the ministers who had laid the solid foundation for ChAFTA, and Professor James Lawrenson. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my real delight to be invited to this remarkable event. I would like, on behalf of the Chinese Embassy and His Excellency, the Ambassador Xiao himself, to extend sincere congratulations on the launch of the analysis on ChAFTA by Australia-China Relations Institute and the success of this tonight's event. First of all, please allow me to read the congratulatory message from the Ambassador Xiao. The message reads, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the signing and entry into force of ChAFTA, the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, in partnership with ACBC, hosts this event, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, assessing outcomes a decade on. On behalf of the Chinese Embassy in Australia, I would like to extend my appreciation for the successful convening of this event and express my sincere congratulations on the release of the relevant report. In 2014, during President Xi Jinping's successful state visit to Australia, leaders of both countries jointly announced the substantive conclusion of negotiations on ChAFTA. In 2015, the agreement was officially signed and entered into force. Over the past decade, China-Australia bilateral economic and trade cooperation has achieved remarkable progress. The increasingly frequent exchanges in trade and investment have not only deepened our economic ties, but also built bridges of understanding and friendship between our two peoples. In recent years, under the strategic guidance of the leaders of both countries, China-Australia relations have seen stabilization, improvement, and comprehensive turnaround, and are now at a critical stage of further development on the basis of stability. Looking ahead, there is enormous potential and bright prospects for practical economic cooperation between our two countries. China is ready to work with Australia to further strengthen cooperation in traditional sectors such as energy, resources, and agriculture, while actively exploring opportunities in emerging areas, including green development, the digital economy, artificial intelligence, scientific and technological innovation, and the health industry, so as to promote the greater development of China-Australia relations. At present, the world economy is facing growing fragmentation and rising instability and uncertainty. Under the pretext of reciprocity, the United States has imposed additional tariffs on imports from many countries, including China and Australia, in blatant violation of WTO rules and severely undermining the rules-based multilateral trading system. Trade wars produce no winners, and protectionism will lead nowhere. Both China and Australia are beneficiaries of free trade. China is ready to work with Australia to safeguard the multilateral trading system, maintain the stability of global industrial and supply chains, and protect an open and cooperative international environment, and promote economic globalization in the right direction. I hope that participants from the business and academic communities of both countries could seize this opportunity to contribute their insights and wisdom, fully tapping the potential of ChAFTA and deepening mutually beneficial cooperation so as to elevate China-Australia economic and trade relations to a new level. Wish this event a complete success. Wish China-Australia economic and trade cooperation a brighter future for the benefit of our two countries and our peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, as the ambassador highlights in his message, since the implementation of ChAFTA a decade ago, our bilateral trade and economic cooperation has boomed. Over the past decade, China-Australia bilateral trade has flourished rapidly, while China remains stable on the top of Australia's trading partners. The two-way trade has more than doubled, increasing from $144.8 billion in 2015 to $325.5 billion in 2024, last year. Australia's trade surplus with China has achieved nearly a five-fold increase. Australian wine, beef have become a kind of luxury for Chinese households. At the same time, more and more Australian consumers favor the cost-effective Chinese products such as home appliances, solar panel, EVs, etc., and Chinese brands like Hisense, TCL, BYD, Media has been increasingly popular among Australian consumers. Made in China has become an indispensable part of Australian households, providing firm support for easing the cost of living pressure and green transformation. Over the past decade, our bilateral investment has been expanding. The aggregate investment from China to Australia has reached nearly $90 billion. More than 800 companies have been established by Chinese enterprises in Australia, providing over 25,000 jobs. Projects like CITIC Pacific Mining, Cattle Hill Wind Farm, Melbourne's high-capacity metro trains, Walla Solar Power Plant, and Tianqi Lithium Kwinana Facility have made their contribution to local economic and community development. Meanwhile, Australia's investment to China exceeds $55 billion, with the establishment of more than 600 companies. In 2018, Cochlear built its first overseas production and R&D center in Chengdu, China, who has so far enabled nearly 50,000 hearing-impaired children in China to hear, speak, and go to school. Today, Cochlear has evolved from in China for China to in China for the world, becoming an outstanding Australian company investing in China. The vibrant economic connection brings the flourish of people-to-people exchanges. Before the pandemic, there were nearly 200 flights every week between our two countries, and the two-way tourists reached nearly 2 million annually. These exchanges have in turn further promoted stronger business collaboration between our two nations and therefore benefited our peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in an uncertain time. Just a few days ago, the U.S. Liberation Day announcement has seriously undermined the rules-based multilateral trading system, which has brought us peace, stability, and prosperity since World War II. The so-called reciprocal tariffs is casting turmoil over the slowly recovering world economy. Multilateralism and free trade are facing unprecedented challenges as unilateralism and protectionism are soaring. And we are at a crossroads. China has reiterated that any trade war or tariff war has no winners, and protectionism leads nowhere. China is always ready to make the development pie bigger, benefit all the people around the world, rather than putting self first without taking note of others' interest. Opening up is China's fundamental national policy. Despite the headwind against globalization, China will unswervingly pursue reform and opening up. China will remain committed to open the door even wider. We will advance our modernization with Chinese characteristics on all fronts, steadily expand its institutional opening up with regard to rules, regulations, management, and standards. China's market offers vast prospects, stable policy expectations, and a secure environment, making it a thriving destination conducive to investment and business growth for enterprises worldwide. We have set the GDP growth target at around 5% this year. To achieve this goal, China's economy had the fundamental conditions required, and we have full confidence in our governance capabilities and future growth potential. China stands ready to share development opportunities with countries around the world, including Australia. At this new starting point, marking the decade anniversary of ChAFTA, what should and can we do to advance our economic and trade cooperation and collaboration over the next decade and beyond? I think we can tap the potential of ChAFTA to foster new growth momentum, making our economies more robust and resilient to better address global challenges. We can expand bilateral trade by aligning policies and standards between our two countries, enhancing trade liberalization and facilitation, and promoting emerging sectors like e-commerce. Minister Farrell has proposed $400 million trade target, which I believe is well-founded, achievable, and within reach. We can advance two-way investment as China is building a modern industrial system driven by innovation and high-quality development, and Australia advances its Future Made in Australia agenda. Our two nations can strengthen cooperation in traditional fields like energy, mining, agriculture, infrastructure, etc., as well as emerging areas such as climate change, energy transition, green development, the digital economy, AI, and health and life science, forging rational and resilient industrial supply chains. We can deepen our multilateral collaboration as before. Both China and Australia have benefited from economic globalization and free trade. As key members of G20, WTO, and other multilateral frameworks, we can continue to jointly advocate for open market, reject protectionism, amplify our shared commitment to the multilateral trading system, and ensure the global economy continues to share opportunities through openness for common development. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past decade, ChAFTA has propelled China-Australia economic ties to unprecedented heights. Looking ahead, I'm confident that this agreement will continue to provide a comprehensive, high-quality, and balanced institutional framework, guiding our cooperation toward even greater achievements in the decades to come. Last but not least, wish today's event a full success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Gao, and also please extend our thanks to Ambassador Qian for his kind remarks. We're now going to shift into a different phase of the evening, and as Minister Farrell mentioned, we're fortunate not only to have the current sitting Trade Minister with us tonight, but to be joined by Dr Craig Emerson and Andrew Robb. I'm not sure of the collective noun for Trade Ministers. ChatGPT suggested a tariff, but we won't go there. As many in this room would be aware, and certainly our friends online as well, both the former Trade Ministers have continued to contribute and to serve the bilateral relationship. Craig as ACBC New South Wales President, and more recently co-chairing the last two Australia-China high-level dialogues, and Andrew through a range of honorary positions and chairmanships, as well as being the grand architect in many respects for ChAFTA. They'll be joined to my right by Glenda Korporaal, who's a senior writer and columnist and a former associate editor at The Australian, with a 30-year career including postings in Washington, New York, London and Hong Kong. Glenda is very well placed to moderate this evening's panel, which will also include a Q&A for those of you in the room. Could you please join me in making Glenda, Craig and Andrew very welcome to the stage.
Okay. All right. Look, thank you all for coming. And I think when James scheduled or thought about this event, he didn't realise that the timing of it was pretty amazing, because it was meant to look at the 10 years of ChAFTA, but now we're all in a very, the debates of the merits of trade and free trade and protectionism have sort of become headline issues, and it's interesting to talk about free trade, but when you don't have it or when there's a threat, it actually has huge economic implications. Anyway, we've got two former trade ministers here. Andrew, let's go back to November 2014. How hard, when ChAFTA the agreement was announced, how hard was it for you to get it done? And you're, a Liberal government, Abbott's the Prime Minister, I mean.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, Tony Abbott as PM, we had a chat very early on and agreed, we both were very committed to it, but he brought his authority not only to this one, but to all the others. And I said, mate, you've got to go and he went and he saw the President, and they made a commitment on a date. And it's amazing how useful that became, because things...
Nothing like a deadline. Yeah.
Things got fairly awkward at different times on different issues. One in particular, we were nearly finished all the products, and then we were going to do services. And we lost 9 months, because every time I raised 2 or 3 products in particular, it seemed to, be a roadblock, and we were going nowhere. And finally, I was talking to some Chinese businessmen who knew both countries and explained my problem. And they said, you've got to understand, there's still a few 100 million people, 300 at the time, who are below the poverty line. I mean, China's brought 800 million out of poverty in this century, but there's still 300 million. And he said, they're staple diets, 2 oil seeds and sugar. And if the agreement, does something to that, they'll find out because of mobile phones these days. And they'll think, if Australia's got a benefit on our products, what did Beijing get? Australia must have given them something. And then they'd have grounds for even insurrection. Right? And this was a thing. Next time I go in, I say to the Minister, I've been thinking about what your problem is. So let's create let's think we've got a box here, and we'll put those 3 products in, and we'll put it in the agreement to be opened in 3 years' time. Right? And that's what they're doing now. It's taken a while longer than 3. But after that, big smile. See, it was local politics. His local politics was a problem. And I didn't know. For a long time, I didn't know. We raced through the rest. It was just... So you have these sort of issues, but once you get through it, because China really wanted... It wasn't just the products. All the agreements to date with developing countries do products well, but it was the services. And most of them don't like opening up on services in any way. And, all of the trade establishment in Geneva and that was saying to me, Andrew, you shouldn't be in this. They're gonna mug you. They're gonna walk all over you, right? And you're gonna be stupid. You're gonna feel stupid. But it wasn't me. It was China could see down the line that with services, they wanted to be a mature economy. And a mature economy, 70% of your GDP comes from internal consumption. Now, they haven't quite got there. That's why they're back focusing on exports again. But they opened up on services like you wouldn't believe, and the establishment in Geneva were just gobsmacked. And that's why it is the best bilateral agreement still in the world.
Craig, you were the Trade Minister before. I remember this went on for years and years, the talk about negotiating a free trade agreement. What was your role? And also, in the history of Australia-China relations, the Labor Party and Bob Hawke and Keating were pioneers in opening up things like the Pilbara. But why did it take a Liberal government to negotiate this?
Well, I guess my role preceded that of Trade Minister. I was working for Bob Hawke in 1986 when he went to China, and we knew all about, or you know all about Mount Chenar, I think it was, 1987 election. Can I tell a little story about that?
Go for it, yes.
We gambled, and that's not unusual for Bob Hawke, and gone to Perth and had nothing to announce because we wanted to announce the Mount Chenar iron ore development, and it looked like it wasn't coming through. And Bob said, well, we're just going to take a gamble on, we're going to wait, we're not going back east. I think Ross Garnaut was the ambassador at the time, and it came through at about 5 o'clock that evening. Pretty nerve-wracking, but they were the early days. Much later, as Trade Minister, not long after I was appointed, I said to officials, how's it going with the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement? And they said, we've had 17 meetings. And I said, and what's been agreed? And they said, nothing. Right, well, this is not going to, the 18th, 19th and 20th aren't going to lead to anything if we stay on this track. So I went to the embassy, Chinese embassy in Canberra with Chen Yuming and his wife, and I said, how about we kick along this trade agreement?
What year was this?
That would have been 2012.
Right.
Or it might have been 2011 actually.
Right.
And again, officials said, oh, that won't amount to anything. And I said, well, we'll see. And within about 3 weeks, a very senior Chinese official came to Australia and started talking to the department, said, come on, let's get it moving.
So it sort of got it going. Yeah.
And so that's basically the role I played. I won't say any higher because we weren't actually getting into the negotiations as such. It was more like kick-starting it because it was in neutral. And then Andrew, I think, did a very good job in negotiating the detail of that agreement. And I looked up today, Googled it, that there was a problem with it, Andrew, on the Labor side, which was about the recognition of skills. Yes. And again, I was asked to get involved in that, which I did. And I think we simply changed that the people who do the recognising ultimately would be the minister, not...
But it did look like at one point Bill Shorten might try and block it or oppose it.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of, I don't know, Don, but there was a lot of language, and there always is.
Yes.
You know, in Lindsay Tenner, a colleague of mine, once said to me when I first started as an MP, he said, Craig, in politics, everyone exaggerates. And it's true, you know, there's all this really tough language, but if there was a way through, then we weren't going to stand in the way of it, and that was the way through. To give the minister the final say, rather to reassure plumbers and electricians and so on that their jobs weren't just going to be taken from them. So that's a brief history of Labor's involvement in...
I think that issue was addressed in James's paper, that it was seen to be an issue, but in the end didn't really emerge to be.
I think both sides actually were looking for a way out, like a way through, notwithstanding the sort of tough political rhetoric.
So Andrew, yes.
To add to that, I think Penny Wong was my counterpart.
Yeah.
She was the shadow minister, and with all the agreements, look, the unions historically, you know, are not enthusiastic about trade agreements, and a lot of it was all sort of centred on people movement, etc. And I've got to say, every time there was that issue, and then I'd have a talk with Penny, and she said, okay, thank you, I'll go away and have a look at it, da-da-da. She'd come back and she'd say, Andrew, if you can do this and this and this, I can keep the caucus, which I think she meant the unions happy. But if you look at it, it hasn't altered what you want. So she was hugely constructive, and I think I really admired and was grateful for her contribution, and I'm sure it reflected the senior people within the Labor. But they did, both sides did want it, actually.
And if I just quickly say, if you're the secretary of a union,
Yes.
you need to be seen to be doing something on these things, right? You need to be seen to be protecting your members. So it goes from Penny to the union leaders and so on, and they're not all crazy people. They just say, well, this looks bad for us. It looks like we're very weak. So give us something so we can say we're stronger. And that's how a lot of these negotiations work.
So, Andrew, if we go from the agreement, it's signed, I think Xi Jinping came out here, the progress, because there was a progressive reduction in tariffs on things like sort of wine and I think beef and things like that. Can you just describe how it opened, how trade expanded in those years? And maybe we'll get to sort of peak ChAFTA in 2018. We can discuss the situation there. But.
It was very rapid. I mean, we started with a combined trade of 98 billion, which is quite significant. But we're now at 330 billion.
Yes.
I mean, it's just amazing. And but it happened very quickly. You see, when actually the United States assisted China to come into the WTO in 2001, before that, only the state-owned enterprises could trade and invest offshore. But with coming into the WTO, they had to allow all of the private companies. 6 million private companies came into the global trading system, right? And of course, that's why we've seen that humanitarian miracle and economic miracle over the 20 years. But that was also a big part of seeing once they got the green light and they've got all these opportunities and the tariffs came off so many things very quickly, and then others were staggered. But even, all of ours, I think, by 2019, we were back to zero for 100% of their inputs. And I think they've still got maybe even one or two to go, I can't recall. But again, they'll finish up 98, 99% of zero tariffs. Now, that is a huge competitive advantage on so many fronts. Second thing is, they're such complementary. What we do well, China needs. What China does well, we need. And really, there were very few, unlike other agreements, where we had a problem with both wanting, concessions on the same product in some way or other. So that also has made a huge difference. The third thing I'd say is that, I don't know what it is, it's, I deal still endlessly in the region, in Vietnam and Indonesia and in India, and they're all good partners of ours, etc. But there's something about the personalities. The Chinese business people seem to like doing business with Australian business people, and vice versa. There's some chemistry there which I can't, and I've got a couple of companies where we source everything from China, and so I'm dealing, I get the same experience. It's even their sense of humour, once you get over the language issue, is pretty similar. But so these things are material in terms of, you want to enjoy what you're doing. So if you find a country where you got a great trading advantage and you find you like doing business, and the Chinese have become hugely professional on all of the post-deal stuff. It's one thing to reach a deal, and that can be still as hard as anywhere with the Chinese, obviously. But once they shake on it, one, it sticks. They stick. You're not back a day later looking for another 10% or something. It sticks invariably. But also, all the paperwork, like your container, they'll tell you when it's going to get on the port and when it's going to be in your warehouse, etc., etc. They're on top of all that sort of minutiae, boring.
A deal's a deal, yeah.
The deal's done, but also that costs a lot. If your container's left on the port for a month and then you're arguing about who's going to pay for it and all this, that's real. It's you know, all of a sudden, a lot of what you're doing, but other people don't see that. So when the Chinese, there's a lot of that very good, efficient trade practice that's been, they've adopted very quickly to the customs rules and things in so many countries, and they make that sort of thing happen. So it's been a good experience, and it's continued, and it got us through, you know, when we hit the political bumps. I see we sort of have a commercial relationship with China, which has just got better and better and better. Nothing has interfered really with that. COVID, of course, flattened out for everybody, just they didn't see one another. But it's got better and better and better. Then we've got a political relationship. That's the one we have to keep strongly working hard at. And I do give a lot of credit to the current government in Australia for stabilising that relationship and maintaining the stability of it. It's such an important thing. You read the report, you know, what we're getting out of it as a country is unbelievable, and we've got to be... There's tens of millions of dollars have come out of this agreement, year on year on year, and thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. And what are you here for but to make these things happen?
So, Craig, if we go to the Turnbull-Morrison government, there were strains in the relationship, and then that led to Chinese action on barley, beef and wine and coal, I remember.
Cotton.
And so how did you think that this could scuttle ChAFTA, or it could scuttle the, you know, this trade relationship which has really grown under ChAFTA?
I was very concerned about it because China did it because it felt seriously aggrieved, and there's no point re-prosecuting that. The more important part of it was how did it get unwound. And I'm going to use two words that have been used to me by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Jan Adams, and this fellow sitting over there, quiet diplomacy. You don't say, when I go to China, I'll be demanding that they take the tariffs off this and that and all that. It's just going and meeting your counterpart, establishing a relationship. I think you might have shared a bottle of wine from...
your vineyard?
or two, apparently. But they developed a relationship, and I suspect the first thing that Don did was develop the relationship. They knew why he was coming, and he went time and time and time again. But each time there was a personal discussion and the building of that relationship. And I'll add one more word, respect. What he did is showed respect to his counterpart. Then the counterpart will go further at home, because he's got to get this approved by the President, members of the Politburo. But I guess what we say in the old language, going that extra mile.
Right.
He was willing to do that because of the way that the Minister went about it. And I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to him.
I'm concerned we want to have some time for questions, but I think rather than go through the details of the of ChAFTA, I mean, let's get to now. I mean, it was interesting when China was imposing, there was these issues with $20 billion worth of trade. People were saying that China needs to respect the rules-based order, and now we're seeing the US completely rip up the rules-based order. I mean, where do you see, start with you, Andrew, and then where do you see ChAFTA fitting in, and where are we with the rules-based order, and what's going to be the relationship between Australia and China in this sort of Trumpian world?
Well, just because the US, which is unbelievable, but just because they've walked away from the system that they led and successfully helped you know, exist and perform. The last 70 years has been the most successful period, prosperity in the world ever. And it's all due to those rules and the commitment of so many countries, especially the West, through most of it, and then progressively China and others. This is what, you know, is frustrating, because the evidence is there time and time and time again. If you open the economy up, you know, in the 15th century, China was by far the biggest and most successful country in the globe. And then they
closed the door.
They closed the door, and they missed the Industrial Revolution, and then the rest happened. So having been king of the castle for 18 centuries, they had 200 years, but now they're heading back. They're re-emerged, not emerging, re-emerged to share the global power and leadership. And the Americans don't like that to start with, and no one likes to be. This is the problem. It's a power struggle, and the rest of us are caught in it, right? And the Americans are perpetrating so much of it, and throwing out all the rules. But what's it mean for us? I don't see. We can't impact on the US. I mean, we can't do anything. We can't impact on China either, to be honest. You know, we're too small, and we've got to look what we can do. And what we can do is to stay true with all of our other alliances. I mean, we've got 700 million people in the ASEAN. We've got 1.4 billion in India. We've got 1.4 billion in China. Now, that's a huge market in itself. And they are important markets already. If you take the bloc, ASEAN countries as a bloc, they're our second biggest trading partner after China, right? So, and they're opening up, and there's billions being invested there from around the world. So I think we've got to take even the set of rules that a lot of us have agreed to, with it, you know, through TPP and RCEP, put them together, take it even further, go and do our deal with
push
Europe,
even harder on
do a free trade agreement with Europe, which is, you know, we're on the cusp of, I think, and Don can talk to you more about that. But we should do those things, and actually this gives us an opportunity to focus. You know, 6 months ago, people said, "We're too busy.
Who cares?"
You know, yeah, you know. But now there's an incentive, and therefore you can't do anything about the US, but we can do some things which will, over time, be very material to our future and all the rest of it.
So, Craig, where does ChAFTA and our trade relationship with China and the rules-based order fit in with this sort of chaos that we're getting with the US?
I had the opportunity to have two conversations with Foreign Minister Wang Yi. I was, as you mentioned, been the co-chair of the Australia-China High-Level Dialogue, and in 2023 we went to Beijing, and they said, "Oh, there could be a meeting, you know, outside where we were in the guest house," and so on. And that meeting did occur, and we started talking about these things, put the notes away, and he said to me, "China believes in the rules-based trading system." And then there was a second Australia-China Business Council meeting in Canberra, and he said the same thing to me. So let's take that as given. If China's a big economy, it keeps pushing what is the right approach for China, continue to push for free and open trade. I don't want people to get offended with this word, but when I was doing trade policy at university on protectionism, it was said by very senior scholars, just because someone else shits in their nest, you shouldn't shit in your nest, right? And it's actually true. Because a country puts tariffs, what that is a big tax, and that will, you know, increase the cost of living in that country. There's no way around that. It's just a fact.
Consumers will pay.
And then the consumers pay, and then there's unemployment to follow. That's just the way it rolls. And so why would the other country who's being subjected to those tariffs say, we're going to do exactly the same to our people? It's really the dumbest idea you could come up with. So the recommendation from me and from my very esteemed professors who talked about these things and nests is don't do it to yourself, don't do it to others, just keep going. And here's a possibility. I combine that thought of Wang Yi, we believe in the rules-based system. Why wouldn't China say, we have an opportunity to be the good global citizen, good global, not just regional, but the good global citizen, where we show that we are not going to get into competitive tariffs and all that sort of stuff, and we would redouble our efforts at the World Trade Organization and so on. I think that would be smart advice, and I'm happy to give it. But that's the way I would be thinking of responding to the situation we find ourselves in.
So I've got plenty of questions, but we've got some very well informed people in the audience. Does anyone have questions for any of our panellists? Okay, thank you.
I think as George here at Phoenix TV, it's very interesting 10 years anniversary. This is a great time. Thank you very much. And I've got questions for both former minister and Australian relations, of course, go ahead. But now recently the Davenport, both leaders, to talking about to get back to Australia. So, which is in last year, and Australian government informed the Davenport operator, which is not in national security matters. So it's clear. When this year, and both leaders saying, okay, they would take Davenport back to Australia. So now question is, if Australian government to force Chinese company to sell their share to Australian or whatever, Australian government to take back, and is it because Australian-China relation will be damaged? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
You want to start, Andrew?
Well, look, it's because we're in the middle of a campaign. I don't really want to start having a long discussion about the Darwin port because it's a political issue, and I'm not going to. But what I will say, though, is that as the former investment minister, not just trade but investment, I went around the world and met most of the big funds in most of the countries, the Middle East, in Canada, you name it. And so many of them said to me, we're investing in Australia, but Andrew, it's very difficult because you're a very high-cost country, and it's very hard to, to make the numbers come together. But they said, we keep investing in Australia because there is no sovereign risk, right? And they said, we are investing in Australia because once the deal's done, you don't change the rules, right? So things like the coal tax in Queensland, one of our strongest friends in Japan, the trading houses are beside themselves because of the change of rules, which has cost them billions and billions of dollars. Yeah, so and it's been a great strength of Australia. So I say to both parties in this situation, think about that. Okay.
Do you want to come in on this?
Oh, not really.
All right, we'll move on. There's a lady over there.
Thank you very much. Mimi Tso from the University of New South Wales. Just first, I want to thank James and your team for really excellent analysis of this important milestone, and thanks for putting on today along with friends at the ACBC. It's wonderful to be here, and really enjoyed the conversation with Craig and Andrew. Look, I really have to just put it out there, being obviously a representative of the higher education sector, that obviously this is going to be an interesting time for the sector, given how important it is in the relationship between Australia and China, and the fact that it is Australia's second largest export. So here, I mean, I'm not representing my university, but certainly those of us who are in the sector are obviously seriously concerned about both parties' policies in relation to international student caps. And so this is obviously something that I'm not particularly optimistic. It could be a short-term political stint, but certainly there is, I think, a significant risk in basically undermining the importance of our international students in Australia in terms of not just economically, we shouldn't see these students as commodities, but also just how important this human-to-human relations like between the two countries is, and that the international students embody. So just your thoughts, both of you, on where this might head.
Well, I didn't mention, so this gives me an opportunity to do so. I was the architect of the white paper on Australia in the Asian century, and we looked at newer things. You know, we knew about iron ore. There's not much more you can write about it, and the traditional commodities, coal and so on, natural gas, but we're looking more to the future, and Chinese students studying in Australia was right up there, along with some other pretty interesting ideas, but we won't go through those. I think the limitations are not about China, they're more about housing, and there is a real housing issue. I don't, and the only other caution that I would add is, there's no evidence of Chinese students falling into the following category, but where there's rorting, and there's no evidence of Chinese students being involved. So they're the, or institutions, they're the two kind of constraints. Otherwise, double it, treble it, quadruple it. You know, I think it's fantastic, and I think it's a massive investment in our relationships as well, because the chances of those students either staying here or coming back are very high. And when they go home, they are ambassadors for our country, and that is just fantastic. So I think it's a great, I'm not going to call it an industry because that sounds a bit impersonal. It's very personal, and I think of all of those students as ambassadors for their country and for Australia.
Are you worried about
yes, I was at one stage Australia's Minister for Vocational Education, but SEPS I've spent time, and I'm really committed to. I spent the last 2 years taking the Australian curricula, VET curricula, and teaching thousands in Vietnam.
Wow.
Thousands. And then got cut out overnight. And our first...
That's because of change in policy here.
That was to teach, we'd do thousands, and then we could pick the top 5% and say the best. And then we could say to builders here who wanted to sponsor, not only have they got the English level, they've done the first 2 semesters of our training, and we're de-risking, and they're the best. They're motivated. They're highly motivated. And it was a great model, and then literally we had 4 different streams of things, and with a joint venture with the Ho Chi Minh Technical College. And it just, 18 months ago, the caps came in, the visas stopped. 98% of the visas applications didn't get in Vietnam, where we were getting the first 300, we had 1 knockback, and the other 299 got through in 2 or 3 days because we'd worked very closely with the visa people. They understood what we were doing. The quality of it was Australian curriculum. So the opportunities, that's one thing in Asia, especially ASEAN countries, they're opening up and they're getting all this money, but their skill level in so many areas is about 85%, right? So micro-credentials as well as training the younger ones, they're just unbelievable opportunities. But the second, and it's more important, you go with your strengths. When I went to every trade agreement, all I had in my head was resources and energy, agriculture, health, education and tourism. They're the 5 things I think we do as well as anybody and better than most, right? And so I looked to get really good outcomes in those 5 areas. And then of course you work around the edge on all sorts of other issues. But that, and people, you all should back your strengths. Education, like Mimi just said, it's our second biggest. It's one of our great strengths. And here we are doing what we're doing. I'm chairman of a little cladding company, wall cladding. I can tell you, we've got lots of builders who've got lots of land and they've got hundreds and thousands of homes to build. They're not building them, not because of students. It's irrelevant, it's a political ploy, it's a dishonest thing that both parties are saying to the electorate that it's the students that are causing. It's the same number as we had in 2019, right? Yeah. So how are they causing more problems with housing? And the cladding, all of these builders are saying we've got a 30% increase in costs, and we haven't got trained construction people. We're 100,000 short, so we're not doing anything. We're sitting on that land. We're not going to build until those costs change. That's the problem with housing. And we should be, as Craig said, we should be having more and more and more, but also going into the region, in my view, and helping them. Think of the soft power in all of those ASEAN countries if we help to train the trainers in there.
Now, I'm conscious that you've got to get a plane fairly soon, but do we have any other questions?
I've got 10 minutes, I'm sorry, but I've got to go on to Brisbane, where I'm meeting actually a lot of senior people from a Chinese company to get them involved in the new development of a port at Gladstone, a container port. It's already a very big resources port, and build railways and all sorts of things. So this is consistent with the theme we've got tonight.
Okay,
right?
all right.
Thank you. Lee Howard from AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne. 10 years ago, a different era. I'm interested in your reflections on what might have aged well with ChAFTA over the last 10 years and perhaps what might not have aged so well. And perhaps a second part, if you were negotiating ChAFTA today to make it relevant against the current context, the volatility that we're seeing in global markets, what would be most important in a modernised ChAFTA?
Good question. Look, we tried to build in, and we did build in, 3-year reviews because nothing stays relevant for a long time, And when you think of the last 10 years with AI and everything, it's just ChAFTA needs to go back and have a look, and they are. They're engaged, I understand, on the review process. So a lot of it is all those things that Mr. Feng, Mr. Gao Feng had to say, all of the things that we can do together. He was reading the script from the review, I think, that they're putting together at the moment. So there's so much in that, so much in that technology area that applies to all of it. It's very relevant to agriculture. It's very relevant to the mining. It's not as though we leave all those strengths. It's how do we pick up all these other technological and other innovations that have occurred, and how do we apply it across all of those sectors so that we stay leader of the pack with those 5 strengths.
What would you say?
I'd be similarly thinking of those things. Our daughter's a nurse, and it's still the case that nurses and aged care workers do a lot of handwriting on stuff, and then someone else puts it in. So bit of low-hanging fruit would be any advances in China that have been made in the digitisation of all those manual processes. And then I go to AI, and this is just an idea that I mentioned the Chinese side only a few weeks ago up in Brisbane. When we do scans of someone's body because there's a condition, the person who's doing the scan then looks at it, right? And that's good because they've got some skills. But why not get a huge number of those scans and use AI to say, there's a 95% probability of that being benign, da-da-da. Now, I think that is something, without being an expert on it, if we could collaborate in those sorts of areas, both the cost of all of those, that scanning would fall, but more importantly, the reliability would rise. Now, who would be against that? So that's what I think would be a great idea. And I did, as I said, I raised that with the Chinese side up in Brisbane at a ABAC meeting, which is APEC Business Advisory Council meeting. So it's my little hobby horse now.
Now, I'm conscious of the time, so can we sort of, and I know James is going to give a little more detail of his paper, but I mean, if we were here in a few years' time, where do you see the rules-based order? Where do you see our trade with China? Are you optimistic, or are we going into a very uncertain global time where trade and protectionism is wound back?
The rule about sitting in nests is that irrefutable, cannot be reversed, right? So people can try the protectionist route, but in the end, it'll be to the disadvantage of their own people. Now, their own people won't say, oh, that's because of, they'll just say, gee, inflation's up, and now we've got unemployment rising as well. So in a sense, this will be self-correcting, but the trick is how quickly you can make that self-correction.
And maybe how painful it will be.
And I think advocacy of the rules-based system is really important. We're talking about regional trade agreements, FTAP, Free Trade Area for Asia and the Pacific. Andrew's got one model which is, and I'll let him speak for himself, but looking at existing trade agreements and so on. Mine is different, where you take initiatives within APEC countries. Not everyone has to be in it, any initiative. Therefore, it's like a plurilateral. And you say, why don't we work on that together? And then another group, or the same group but with a bit of overlap, work on something else together. And another group work and build the whole thing from the ground up. And if a particular country says, we don't want to be involved, you say, that's fine. If there's another time when you do, just knock on the door and, the door will be open to you. But I think that it's really important for the Asia-Pacific region, and I am advocating for APEC here, to show that it can be dynamic in these circumstances. And if America doesn't want to be involved in that for the next few years, well, that's actually more their problem, because the economic consequences will be visited on America. But so I think we could say, let's use APEC, let's use the WTO to the extent that they're still alive, and keep pressing on with free trade.
Okay, Andrew, we'll be quick because I know you've got a dash.
Well, I agree. We should focus now. You get work on what you can do. We can't do anything with the US. They're not in any of the agreements now, in TPP or RCEP. And that's what, Craig's like another bit. I've always used to say at APEC, we've got to eventually put TPP together with RCEP, because basically you've got nearly all the countries. And if, as he said, if some don't want it, but we've actually got 15 in one and 12 in the other, and there's a bit of commonality. But the main thing is also got China in RCEP. So all of a sudden, at the starting point, and then you work together, and of course, none of those rules, you improve them all. and come to one set of rules. And then you've got an Asia-Pacific free trade zone.
Okay.
Right? And then, of course, if the Americans want to come in, but we've had the benefit of TPP and RCEP without the Americans, and life went on.
Yes.
You know, we had, it's been beneficial for all of us, and so I don't see a problem with that. That's a really great step forward. The other thing is, I think ChAFTA, I think it's got, you know, I think there's a great commitment in both countries to keep opening up, right, and a set of rules, etc. The issue is, and so that's the economic side, that's the commercial side. The issue is the political side, and we just got to both work because, you know, the security people in all our countries, they've got a different view of the world than most of us, right? And so we've got to manage very hard, I think, the stability of the politics, or otherwise it filters into the commercial side, which the commercial side, well, I think, with us and China, it's done. We get to keep improving it, reviewing it, build it, but there'll be a lot of cooperation on both sides to do that. But in order to have those opportunities, we have to really keep an eye on it. And both sides have to be careful of this. You know, ships going up from place to shore, all these sort of things. We're both doing it, and it worries people, and it creates then political unrest, and then that bleeds into the commercial side. So we've got to work very hard at the politics, and I mean, China, because it's big, it's got a responsibility to have a big military, right? So we shouldn't be frightening everyone because they've got another aircraft carrier. They're getting bigger. They'll, you know, first thing my parents said to me, myself and my 8 brothers and sisters,
get an aircraft carrier.
The first responsibility of government is to protect their people.
Right, yeah.
Then they've got a bunch of other things, but protect their people. So the thing is, but it's then, is it defensive or aggressive? That's the big issue. We've got to make sure that we're all on the defensive side. None of us are on the aggressive side.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I think we've all benefited from the collective wisdom of 2 former trade ministers, and I'll hand it back to you, Tom. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Glenda, Craig and Andrew. Ambitious to allow that amount of time with both of you, partly because of the experience and the questions and the context that we're facing at the world, and certainly I think if it wasn't for a plane we'd have a lot more time. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor James Lawrenson to provide a presentation, the third part of this evening, on the Australian assessment of the core outcomes of ChAFTA a decade on, against the backdrop of claims by advocates and critics of the deal, as we heard. James, thanks.
Thank you all. Minister Farrell, Minister-Counsellor Gull, thank you too in particular for being here tonight. And I must say also, as a mere academic, it's quite a thrill to also have in our room tonight 2 legendary former Australian Trade Ministers in Andrew Robb and Craig Emerson. A quick observation. Wasn't it nice tonight to have a current Labor Trade Minister and 2 former Trade Ministers on different sides of the political aisle and an international counterpart in favour of free trade? 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been so stunning, but I'm very grateful that in Australia, that political centre and that political common sense remains, because we know it doesn't remain in some other parts of the world. And on that note, until 3 days ago, Australian exporters knew that they could export their goods to both 2 of our biggest trading partners, China and the United States, at very, very low tariffs indeed. The average trade-weighted tariff for Australian exporters to China was just 1.1%, and to the US it was 0.1%, both incredibly low. Now, of course, today, that's changed. Now, the average tariff Australian exporters face to the US is very, very close to 10%. In other words, the US tariff on Australian exporters is nearly 10 times that of the average tariff that China now places on Australian exports. You may also be interested, I was doing the calculations on this as well. If Australia used the same tariff formula that Washington is currently using, I can tell you that we'd have a 27% average tariff on imports from America. And if we put a tariff on US services exports as well, that tariff would be 77%. Thank goodness our Trade Minister at the moment in the Albanese government, it's supported in a bipartisan way, is not engaging in that sort of destructive activities. Look, when I moved to UTS in 2014, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement was one of the big bilateral developments, one of the first big bilateral developments that I sunk my teeth into and was able to contribute to the public debate on. And so it's a real pleasure to actually look back on it 10 years later, this time assessing outcomes. And I've got to say, it's much easier to do this job when the data is in front of you rather than just make your best estimates and best assessments at the time. Look, as the title of this research makes clear, this is an assessment of core outcomes. The big topics we stick to, of course, there's any number of things we could talk about, but I just focus on the key issues. The second thing to say is that this is an Australian assessment. It's deliberately so, it's an Australian assessment. Now, I would actually encourage my Chinese counterparts in China to undertake their own assessment because, of course, while Beijing and Canberra both agreed that overall it was a good deal for both countries, each side brought their own asks, their own sensitivities to the negotiations. Just one quick point on that is that one of China's expectations would have been that the deal would have led to more access to Australian investment assets. Now, I'm not sure if a Chinese scholar was doing the same assessment I did on the Australian side, whether they would come to the assessment that that expectation has actually been met. But I'll leave it to my Chinese colleagues to do that analysis. Look, the advocates of ChAFTA had a very simple message, and that was this message up here. Andrew, you're looking, well, I think Andrew actually had left, but you can see Andrew's looking fabulous in the photo. And the message was that this deal would create trade and boost Australian prosperity. This is a quote from Prime Minister Abbott at the time. You don't get much more effusive than that. He said, one day we'll be able to tell our children and grandchildren that, yes, we were there the day that this extraordinary agreement was signed. The Business Council of Australia also said, quote, that it would be transformative for the Australian economy, close quote. It would deliver this trade boost in a few ways, but the most obvious was massive Chinese reductions on tariffs for Australian goods and also improved market access for Australian service providers. That said, the ChAFTA's passage through the Australian Parliament was not straightforward. There was a 4-month period from June to October in 2015 when it looked like there was a real possibility the deal could be sunk. At the time, the Bill Shorten-led Labor opposition initially did not extend bipartisan support, although to be clear, Labor at the time did say that it remained committed to the broader principle of free trade and to landing a free trade agreement with China. The Labor Party's position at the time largely reflected concerns from the trade union movement, and we had some trade union leaders say things such as, quote, that ChAFTA would lead to a radical altering of the labour market, close quote, and that in, quote, nearly every sector of the economy, jobs will be offered to Chinese nationals rather than locals, close quote. There was also some claims that some of the Chinese workers that these union officials imagined would enter the country would enter with substandard qualifications and so put Australian workplace safety at risk. There was also a strategic critique, and that critique went something like, if we have a free trade agreement with China, rather than promoting risk mitigating trade diversification, what will happen is that a greater proportion of Australia's trade will be with China, and that could be, in the words of one commentator, lead to, quote, China's economic domination of Australia. So that was the second critique. First around Labor, the second around strategic commentary. So what this analysis we're releasing today does is basically assesses these three big claims. The big claim of the advocates that it would promote trade and enhance Australian prosperity, and then look at the critics who are homing in on labour market issues and the strategic implications as well. Well, look, I think we can knock the trade creation potential of ChAFTA on the head very quickly. Now, of course, you don't need a trade agreement to have robust trading ties. China was already Australia's largest trading partner as early as 2007, but certainly it helps to raise awareness around those underlying economic complementarities and allows Australian and Chinese households and businesses to more readily unlock that trade creation potential. What we see in the trade data is that Australia's trade with China grew from 145 billion in the year before ChAFTA to 326 billion now. So that's a 125% increase. That compares with a 77% increase with respect to the rest of the world. Tick. If we just look at exports, we actually see a 149% increase in Australian exports to China compared with 86% elsewhere. And that increase, that more rapid rate of increase to China, is more or less across all broad categories of goods and services. Similarly, when it comes to imports, a very similar picture. Imports from China increased by 89%, and that was against 69% compared with the rest of the world. And once again, imports from China increased at a more rapid rate compared with the rest of the world across all categories of goods and services imports. So I think it's reasonable to say that the claims made by ChAFTA's advocates that it would create trade and give a boost to Australia's prosperity has largely been borne out. Now, of course, it's also true that the claims of the critics could also be justified, except the data really does not support that conclusion. You'll remember that the claim was that ChAFTA would lead to a radical altering of the Australian labour market. In fact, what the data show is that whether you're looking at the absolute number of Chinese workers coming in, temporary skilled Chinese workers coming into Australia, or whether you're looking at as a proportion of the total number of international skilled workers coming in, both of those numbers have in fact declined. Last year, there were just 2,033 temporary skilled Chinese workers given visas to enter the Australian labour market, accounting for 4% of the total of such visas. And don't forget, total employment in Australia is more than 14 million. Right? 2,000 Chinese workers in a total employment pool of more than 14 million. It's also the case that when you dig into some of the media reporting suggesting that there were examples of Chinese workers undertaking unsafe labour practices in Australia, when you dig into those claims, as we do in this analysis, you find that those claims are essentially without any evidence whatsoever. I'm pretty happy to say that that outcome, that there wouldn't be a flood of temporary Chinese workers coming to Australia, was exactly the point that I was making back in 2015, leading up to the eventual passage of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. That's not surprising, but I won't spend any time talking today. You can read the report as to why, in fact, the outcome that we've seen is the one that we should have expected all along. Now, look, there is still that strategic critique, and here there is some data here we need to acknowledge. It is true that the proportion of Australia's trade with China has increased since ChAFTA was enacted. It's gone from 21% to 26%. That said, I think it's a difficult case to make that ChAFTA has altered in an unnatural way the geographical trade playing field for Australia. And that's because, in fact, Australia has FTAs now with its top 11 trading partners. It's not just China. And those top 11 trading partners account for about 75% of Australia's total trade. I also think just generally it's the case that the argument that increased trade with China, or greater trade exposure, would lead to China to be able to weaponise that trade to influence political decision-making. I think that the evidence also does not bear out that claim. Let me explain to you quickly why. It's certainly the case that despite this growing trade exposure to China, that whether it's coalition or Labor governments, it seems very much to me that both sides of politics have continued to make decisions, strategic decisions, that they both regard as being in Australia's national interest. And I don't need to recount all the examples, but let's just say there's been quite a few decisions made by previous coalition governments, and indeed by the current Labor government, that I don't imagine Beijing is entirely happy with. We also learnt that Australian traders are not defenceless. In fact, I think that was one of the big lessons to come out of the episode of trade disruption, which ran from 2020 to 24, that when China did not want our barley, did not want our coal, in fact, Australian producers are extremely adept at mitigating those risks. And of course, the big reason for that is Australia supports an open trading system, so when China did not want our goods, many of our exporters were able to readily find alternative markets. And it's also true that the big ticket items in the trading relationship, China needs Australia as a supplier as much as Australia needs China as a customer. So the big ticket items, iron ore, lithium, wheat, wool, and so on, they continued even when there was some disruption at a more minor level. So you put all those findings together, folks, and it does not strike me as odd at all that the Australian public, 10 years on, are very supportive of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. I'd like to point to some polling done here by my colleague Eleanor Collinson. She's now run a national poll of Australian public opinion towards the China relationship over the last 4 years, and you can see that last year, 53.4% of Australians thought the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement was beneficial to the country, and that's against just 13.5% who disagreed with that proposition. No surprise, it's created a lot of a trade, it's added to Australian prosperity. Most of the fears that were mooted have in fact not come to pass, and so the Australian public is largely on board. Look, I'll stop there, and let me just finish by thanking my partners for tonight's event, MA Financial, the Australia-China Business Council, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the industry partners of the Australia-China Relations Institute too. I think I'll finish there. Andrew, I might go to you now to wrap things up tonight. I'll be staying around afterwards and very happy to respond to any questions you have about the report. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all attendees, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to each of our speakers tonight. I'm sure you all agree that it's been incredibly insightful to learn more about the history of ChAFTA, the positive impact it's had on our two great nations, and importantly, the significance of ChAFTA today, especially in the context of the current trade tensions and global uncertainties. On behalf of everyone here tonight, I'd like to make some special thank yous. Senator Farrell, Minister, thank you for your ongoing commitment to the Australia-China relationship, and in particular all your hard work in stabilising the relationship. Minister-Counsellor Feng, thank you for your speech and thank you for your message from the Ambassador. Please pass on to the Ambassador our sincere thank yous for his efforts in positive engagement and significant contribution to the bilateral relationship. Andrew Robb, in his absence, we thank him for his vision. We thank him for his leadership in helping drive the ChAFTA negotiations, leading to the historic signing in 2015. Craig Emerson, thank you for your foundational work in expanding trade and the broader relationship with China in the lead up to ChAFTA, so thank you, Craig. Glenda, well done on your moderation tonight. Never an easy task in the current global context, particularly with two former politicians, no disrespect. And of course to James Lawrenson. As always, James, a huge thank you for your expert, calm and objective analysis. We expect nothing further from you, so thank you, James. To the ACBC and ACRI, thank you for your ongoing leadership in the bilateral relationship and to the huge task of arranging tonight's event. Like all attendees here tonight, I have no doubt that we at MA Financial have been a beneficiary of ChAFTA and the enhanced economic collaboration between China and Australia. For that, we are truly grateful. But by continuing to work together, I'm sure China and Australia can navigate the evolving global trade landscape together and achieve ongoing mutual prosperity. So again, thank you for our speakers and attendees tonight for your insights and engagement. Please join us for a drink on the terrace this evening if you're able to, but importantly, please join with me in thanking the participants and speakers tonight.